Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the Quechua language and people. So the Quechua people in South America living in the Andean highlands from Ecuador to Bolivia are the largest of any indigenous peoples in the Americas today. And Quechua is also the name of their language, which was the language of the former Inca Empire, even though the language predates the Inca, and it is the most widely spoken indigenous language of South America today. But more accurately, it is not a single language, but is a series of closely related groups of dialects. Quechua is a language family, which is a group of languages related through descent from a common parental language, in this case, one originating in Peru, where the capital of the Inca civilization was. So the Quechua language spread through the Andes after about 1450 alongside Inca conquest and later Spanish conquest in 1532. Today, Quechua language has somewhere between 8 and 10 million speakers. So the Quechua people were among the earliest peoples to be conquered by the Inca Empire, but it wasn't until the Spanish colonization that their population fell drastically. The Spanish required the Quechua people to produce crops for the Spanish that were unfamiliar to them at the expense of their own food supply. And the Spanish did not provide welfare for forced labor and concentrated the Quechua people in larger, more dense villages than they were accustomed to, which strained their social and political institutions. Like as an example, the Roman Catholic Church created a Christianized version of Quechua, um, like religious beliefs. So there are two main linguistic branches of the Quechua language, and these are mainly distinct. So as the Quechua people diverged and inhabited different geographic settings, the language diverged too. For example, the Quechua that's spoken in the rainforest is influenced not only by direct environmental differences and cultural differences, but also has remained more isolated from historical forces that have been affecting other parts of South America and the Quechua that is spoken there. So the first linguistic branch of Quechua is Quechua 1, which is also called Central Quechua or Waiwash, and it is spoken in the Central Highlands and in the coast of Peru. The second is Quechua 2, and this actually has three further distinctions, so Quechua 2A, 2B, and 2C. 2A is spoken in northern Peru, 2B in Ecuador and southern Colombia, and 2C in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. So out of all of these, Quechua 2C is the most common. And so dialects within each group are pretty consistent, but these different varieties of Quechua have been diverging for over 1,000 years. And so different forms of it can be mutually unintelligible, while other forms are very similar to the others within each branch. And in linguistics, this is what's called a dialect continuum. So some features of the Quechua language, and specifically of Quechua 2C, is that it is a subject, object, verb language. So to say Maria builds a house, the ordering would be Maria house build. Quechua is also highly agglutinative, and this means that words are made up of linear sequences of distinct morphemes. And morphemes are like the smallest irreducible units of meaning in the language. And so each component of meaning in Quechua has its own distinct morpheme. So for example, to say I heard, you would start with the infinitive for the verb hear, which is uyari, and then you would add on a suffix for I to get uyari ni, which means I hear. Then you would add the past tense suffix to get uyari requan ni, which means I heard. And like in English, you might add a small syllable to avoid saying a word that is awkward or difficult to say. Another feature of the Quechua language is that it has what are called topic and focus markers. So topic markers indicate what the topic or theme of a sentence is, and it always is something that has already been mentioned or presupposed. Whereas a focus marker indicates new information or a point of contrast. So for example, if you were to ask who built the house, you would add a focus marker after who since it's unknown and new. And you would add a topic marker for house because it's presumably already been seen or looked at. So Quechua language has come into contact with many other languages, especially Spanish and Aymara. Aymara is spoken by the people of the Bolivian Andes and has almost 2 million native speakers today and shares some similarities to Quechua, but linguists generally reject that they come from a common proto-language. Instead, linguists believe that the similarities in the languages are due to areal features, which are features of language due to geographic area. that resulted from prolonged cohabitation. When it comes to Spanish, there are many borrowings in Spanish from Quechua and vice versa. And as much as 1/3 of current Quechua vocabulary comes from Spanish. For example, cerveza in Quechua, meaning beer, comes from the Spanish word cerveza. And conversely, papa in Spanish, meaning potato, is borrowed from Quechua. So of course, this sort of intermingling is tied to the legacy of colonialism. Quechua was used by the Spanish colonists to convert people to Christianity in their colonial project. So early Andean societies did not use writing, and so Quechua was not written down before the arrival of the Spanish. And recall that the capture of the Inca Empire was in 1532. So before this, Quechua had no standard spelling system. Instead of writing, they kept records through other means, such as the quipu, which was an accounting apparatus made out of knotted textile cords that were used for recording events and storing basic information, but they weren't really designed to store like prose or account for all of the vocabulary or like language structure of Quechua. Until the 20th century, Quechua was typically written using Spanish orthography, which is just another word for spelling. For example, the oldest written record of Quechua was a book written in 1560 by a Spanish missionary. And while this was useful for Spanish speakers to read Quechua, using Spanish orthography failed to account for some of the nuances in Quechua phonology, and that just means the sounds of speech and their meanings. So the representation of Quechua language and culture is tied to colonialism and indigenous rights today. So one important historical event was the Tupac Amaru Rebellion, which was an indigenous uprising against Spanish control of Peru from 1780 to 1783 in southern Peru. Afterwards, Quechua was banned from public use. So Quechua language and its peoples were mobilizing for anti-slavery interests, and they were mobilizing against colonialism. And as a result, we saw how access to Quechua was tied to these colonial objectives. Also, the Spanish-American Wars of Independence from 1808 to 1833, after enduring these wars, Quechua had a brief revival, but was still in decline in use, mainly because Spanish was the main language taught in schools and is used in national economies and with growing urbanization. Also, Spanish was presented as a language of prestige and opportunity, and some were embarrassed to speak Quechua or were punished for it in school. There have been some recent attempts to create space for indigenous languages and histories, such as more funding, or for example, creating Microsoft or Google in Quechua, but this is also complicated since some Quechua people see Spanish as a more effective language for success in mainstream society, but they still want to honor their mother language. There's a lot of mixture between Quechua and Spanish culturally, even today. For example, La Virgen de la Mercedes is a 2-day festival in Ecuador, and it's officially a Roman Catholic tradition. The first day, local bars are closed, and then the next morning is Mass, so sort of resembling some of the features of uh, Roman Catholicism. And then later in the afternoon, there is dancing in costumes with men wearing wigs, with men wearing offerings to the spirits, and a public parade of sacrificed pigs and other items, and singing of traditional Quechua songs. In 1975, the Peruvian government was the first to make Quechua an official language and adopted a new orthography to better reflect Quechua. But spelling within Quechua remains a topic of controversy, and Quechua remains a primarily spoken language. Different forms of Quechua have different standards of orthography today. The absence of Quechua in mainstream society also has its consequences, for example, in matters of land rights. For example, the government of Peru has been allowing multinational oil companies to exploit ancestral territories of indigenous populations since the 1970s, and the Quechua people in many cases have been unable to gain collective title to their ancestral lands. So in summary, like the increased visibility of the Quechua language and peoples is important to bring attention and help stop the encroachment on their lands. So I hope this has been helpful to learn more about the Quechua language and people, and have a good class.